يا بنات بلادنا، يا زاد عنادنا، يا مد عروقنا وغنوة حصادنا. نجوم الليالي والقمر العالي ردوا موالي لبنات بلادنا. جفرات بثوب الحرية مطرز حنون وطراح، والكوفي فلسطيني شالنها عالكتف وشاح. جفرات بثوب الحرية مطرز حنون وطراح، والكوفي فلسطيني شالنها عالكتف وشاح. الهند ندق التحية كل ما رفرف طير جناح. يا بنات بلادنا، ويا مد عروقنا غنوة حصادنا. نجوم الليالي والقمر العالي والردوا موالي يا بنات بلادنا. رجال عحباتها بتغار لو حدا اطلع فيها لك يا رب يا رب مكتوب عنا صار نحمي وطن بحجار وبحجار نبني يا هلا والله برجالنا يا سيوف العز قبالنا والله برجالنا يا سيوف العز قبالنا فرسان تتحدى العدا بقلوب صلب جبالنا يا سيوف العز قبالنا فرسان تتحدى العدا بقلوب صلب جبالنا يا أميرة قلبي لا تخافي اسمك وبلادي عشفافي لا شيلك والله عكتافي ونكتب بالحب كتابنا قلبي لا تخافي اسمك وبلادي عشفافي لا شيلك والله عكتافي ونكتب بالحب كتابنا بالعز قبالنا فرسان تتحدى العدا بقلوب صلب جبالنا يا ربعي واغلى احبابي يا قلبي العايش بترابي ما عندي غالي بحسابي الا ناسك يا ارضينا يا قلبي العايش بترابي ما عندي غالي بحسابي الا ناسك يا ارضينا العز قبالنا فرسان تتحدى العدا بقلوب صلب جبالنا يا دار محروس بوابك عالنار تركض شبابك واختيار اغلى احبابك مثلك غالي يا ترابنا واختيار اغلى احبابك مثلك غالي يا ترابنا
Hi everyone. You don't have to get settled yet. I just wanted to welcome everyone, let you all know that they're
ويا هلا والله برجالنا يا سيوف العز قبالنا فرسان تتحدى العدا بقلوب صلب جبالنا
أنا ابن القدس ومن هون من هون أنا
ابن القدس ومن هون مش متزحزح قاعد فيها اسمعني يا كل الكون لحن وعظمي منها وفيها
أنا ابن القدس ومن هون مش متزحزح قاعد فيها اسمعني يا كل الكون لحن وعظمي منها وفيها والقدس
الله حميها
راح نفديها يشهد الله راح نفديها أنا ابن القدس ومن هون مش متزحزح قاعد فيها والله مش متزحزح قاعد فيها اسمعني يا كل الكون لحمي وعظمي منها وفيها ولحمي وعظمي منها وفيها والقدس الله حميها القدس الله حميها ولو مهما بتمر سنين عبوابك نبقى صامدين لو مهما بتمر سنين عبوابك نبقى صامدين القدس قلب فلسطين والقدس قلب فلسطين والدم ما بيغلى عليها والدم لا ما يغلى عليها ابن القدس ومن هون مش متزحزح قاعد فيها أو مش متزحزح قاعد فيها اسمعني يا كل الكون لحمي وعظمي منها وفيها أنا لحمي وعظمي منها وفيها والقدس الله حميها القدس الله حميها لو مهما تجوع وتحاصر والمقابر فيها تصادر لو مهما تجوع وتحاصر والمقابر فيها تصادر لا بنتاجر ولا بنهاجر لا بنتاجر ولا بنهاجر أمانة ما نفرط فيها أمانة ما نفرط فيها أنا ابن القدس ومن هون مش متزحزح قاعد فيها اسمعني يا كل الكون لحمي وعظمي منها وفيها أنا ابن القدس ومن هون مش متزحزح قاعد فيها اسمعني يا كل الكون لحمي وعظمي منها وفيها القدس الله حميها والقدس الله حميها
ميل يا غزيل يا غزيل ميل ميل يا غزيل يا غزيل ميل ميل لك ميولة قايل لك أيولة ميل لك ميولة قايل لك أيولة مسقك فنجان قهوة نعمل لك دبولة مسقك فنجان قهوة نعمل لك دبولة منك يا غزيل يا غزيل يا غزيل زمن وزمان هالقمر ما بان من زمن وزمان هالقمر ما بان ميل تنشوفك ولو انه شديد زمان ميل تنشوفك ولو انه شديد زمان ميل عالفية نسقك شربة مية ميل عالفية نسقك شربة مية وارتاح لك شوية حاجة بقى تخيل وارتاح لك شوية حاجة نجي بقى نخيل يا غزيل ميل يا غزيل يا غزيل ميل ميل يا غزيل يا غزيل ميل ميل لك ميولي ميل لك أيولي ميل لك ميولي ميل لك أيولي مسك فنجان قهوة يعمل لك دبولة مسك فنجان قهوة يعمل لك دبولة روح منك يا غزيل يا غزيل يا غزيل
Hi everyone. So we're getting started in just a minute. So hi everyone, and we just wanted to let you know, due to unforeseeable circumstances, Professor Eric Kent won't be able to make it today. But on behalf of the SJP and EJC, I just want to thank you all for coming out to the great panel that we have planned for you guys today. And it's amazing to see so many people that are willing and interested in learning about how Rutgers is involved in a lot of unethical investments that impact people struggling globally. We also want to thank our expert panelists for taking their time to further educate us on this topic and how we can get involved for this fight for justice. And before we get into the panel, we're just quickly going to go over what SJP and EJC are, some information on Israeli apartheid and occupation, and how exactly Rutgers is complicit with Israeli apartheid. So the EJC stands for the Endowment Justice Collective, and as tuition-paying students and future alumni donors, we feel strongly that the University Endowment Fund must be utilized ethically. The endowment must be free from investments in businesses and organizations that profiteer war, human rights abuses, oppression, and violations of international law. SJP stands for Students for Justice in Palestine, and the struggle for a just and free Palestine is more than just a struggle for Palestinians. It is a struggle for Black liberation, gender and sexual freedom, a livable and beautiful planet, and a world where everyone's basic needs are met and all their rights are respected. All pursuits for freedom, justice, and equality are connected, requiring us to cultivate genuine solidarity and with all communities across the world that are struggling against state violence, settler colonialism, and imperialism. Now, just to get into a quick history of Israeli occupation and apartheid, in 1947, Britain ended their colonial rule of Palestine. By allowing and supporting Zionist forces in Palestine, this led to the year-long Nakba, which translates to the catastrophe, and this took place in 1948. During this year-long ethnic cleansing campaign, 78% of historic Palestine was militarily taken over, and 750,000 Palestinians were forcefully displaced. Over 13,000 Palestinians were killed, and over 12 million Palestinians still remain stateless today. Between 1947 and 1949, more than 530 villages and cities were destroyed and ethnically cleansed, and more than 70 massacres were committed. In 1967, a Nakba, which translates to the setback, followed when 100% of historic Palestine fell under military occupation of Israel. 55 years later today, this unjust and internationally illegal occupation still remains. The UN OHCHR establishes that the Israeli occupation of Palestine, a Palestinian territory, is unlawful under the international law due to its permanence and de facto annexation policies of Palestinian land.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about apartheid. A fundamental component of Israel's occupation is enforcement of a racist and colonial system of apartheid against Palestinians. The United Nations defines apartheid as inhumane acts committed in the context of institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. So the reality of apartheid for Palestinians. The Israeli apartheid affects Palestinians' ability to travel to work, school, abroad, and visit relatives via military checkpoints. Right to protest, free speech, a fair trial and citizenship, access to medical resources, electricity, food supplies, and clean water. And it also affects the right to remain in their land without being replaced by illegal settlements housing Israeli settlers. The Palestinian people effectively do not maintain control of their lands, their resources, or their lives under the inhumane, unjust, and suffocating apartheid policies of the occupation. Rutgers' support of Israeli apartheid and occupation. Rutgers currently has $1.3 billion in its long-term investment pool, and it has grown over $500 million since 2012. Rutgers has investments directly in State Treasury of Israel, Israeli Construction Group, Osam Nestle, Motorola, Raytheon, and contracts with Coca-Cola and Caterpillar, and this is not an exhaustive list. So how does the endowment fund work? So alumni and foundations put in their donations to Rutgers, and that goes into the endowment fund, and those are put into investments like many unethical practices that we just talked about, and they get returns on those investments in ways of funding for buildings, projects, scholarships, endowed chairs, and etc. And the endowment investments help build Rutgers.
All right, so oh, my bad, forgot the mic. So once again, we are the Endowment Justice Collective. We are a coalition of Rutgers-affiliated organizations advocating for an ethical future at Rutgers, where university funds are not invested in war, private prisons, and ethnic cleansing. Now, in February of 2020, we made an appeal to the University Board of Governors, which led to Rutgers' decision to divest from fossil fuel in July of 2020. Now, that was a good first step, but we need Rutgers to fully divest from an endowment that invests in human rights violations, to say the least. Now, our current work as the Endowment Justice Collective, on December 6th, we will be making an appeal and submitting it. We already made it to the Board of Governors. Now, if you see this QR code, you can sign your support for the appeal. So I'm just going to give you guys a minute. If you haven't scanned that already, that'll take you to the to a survey where you can sign. Okay, nice. I see a lot of you guys doing it. So I'm just going to give you a minute. It takes a second. It's really quick. Okay. Also, keep an eye out for our social media to see how you can support our campaign for an ethical endowment fund. I'm not sure if all of you can see it at the bottom. There's our Instagram and our Twitter, SJP Rutgers NB. There's some premium content there. It's phenomenal. Okay, I'm going to be moving on now. Now, how else is Rutgers complicit in Israeli apartheid? In 2021, President Holloway signed on an agreement welcoming Tel Aviv University to house operations at the forthcoming Innovation and Technology Hub. Now, Tel Aviv University develops Israeli military philosophy and weaponry and oppresses Palestinians by holding hostage the body of 63 Palestinians killed by the Israeli military forces and will not return the bodies to their families for proper burial. It's kind of heinous. Now it's my pleasure to welcome the current Palestinian Education Director at the Palestinian American Community Center in New Jersey, Abire Sabbagh. She is also a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective and the advisor of SJP New Brunswick.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining and for being here today. I want to also just start by giving a very big thank you and shout out to the SJP and EJC students who put this together in the middle of midterms and prepping for finals and all of the stuff that students have to to be involved in and have to do while being students. So thank you all for doing this, and thank you for dedicating parts of your Friday night to being here. I'm going to get just right into it because we have a lot of really great panelists and we have a really good discussion. I just want to let you all know for the a little bit about the format. So I'm going to invite up our panelists and introduce them. I've prepared a couple of questions that I'm going to ask each panelist, and then we are going to open it up to some audience Q&A. I believe those are the QR codes around the room right, that you can scan and fill out. If you have a question that you want to submit, we're taking submissions through the Google form online only, so you can scan the QR code and put your question in there, and then I will read it aloud to be answered. So if you need a minute to do that, or if you want to just get up at some point if a question comes to mind, please feel free to do so. Okay, so to get right into it, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. I'm going to start by, and as I introduce you, you can come up. We can save the applause till the end for all of them to collectively, because we love collective things. So first, I would like to invite up Iman Abid, who is the Director of Advocacy and Organizing at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Prior to joining USCPR, Iman was the Regional Director at the American Civil Liberties Union of New York for 6 years. She has spent the last decade community organizing across New York on issues ranging from immigration justice to mass incarceration, and also drove very many hours to be here. So thank you, Iman, for being here today. Next, I would like to invite up Dr. Dov Baum, who is the Director of Economic Activism with the American Friends Service Committee. For the last 15 years, she has supported investor and activist initiatives on state violence and studied the occupation, incarceration, surveillance, and security industries in Israel and in the US. She also traveled a very long way to be here, and so thank you for taking the time to come and be part of our panel with us. I'd also like to invite up Wassim Kanaan. Wassim is a grassroots-oriented advocate who currently serves as the vice chair for the New Jersey chapter of American Muslims for Palestine. With AMP, Wassim has organized and helped launch the annual National Date Boycott campaign, which is very relevant to the topic of today's panel, so I would highly recommend for y'all to be involved. Wassim focuses on direct advocacy and working with the community on high-impact projects. Thank you, Wassim, for all the work you do and for being here today. And last but not least, I would like to invite up David Letwin, who is co-founder of Jews for Palestinian Right of Return and a member of the North New Jersey DSA, BDS, and Palestine Solidarity Working Group. His writing has appeared at Electronic Intifada and Mindowis. So thank you, David, for being here, and we can collectively thank all of them. If you all can just give them a round of applause. So as you can tell just from their bios and from what I've introduced, we have a lot of wisdom and expertise and advice that can be given and that can be taken from our panelists. So I really encourage you to ask some questions using the forms. I'm going to start us off by asking a question to Wassim. So Wassim, can you walk us through how Israel perpetuates apartheid and why it is important to name it as an apartheid and settler colonial state?
Check. All right, cool. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Abid, for that question. And shout out to SJP for preparing the presentation at the start. And shout out everybody for being here tonight. These topics are not easy topics. They are complicated topics that require us to genuinely be inquisitive, critical, and fact finders. So to restate, as it was said previously, very beautifully, apartheid is a system of segregation or discrimination on the grounds of race. Now, when talking about apartheid in the context of Palestine, we have to start by understanding Zionism. Zionism as an ideology. So, it's a late 19th century ideology that of a nationalist movement to develop an ethno-supremacist state in Palestine, namely for Jewish folks, but more particularly as we've seen it play out today, for Jewish folks of European descent, right? And so the ideology of Zionism is exclusive in nature. And when you develop a foundation on exclusivity, are we going to be surprised when the outcome is, in fact, a system that is a system based on oppression, on segregation, and on discrimination? You know, simply stated, 1 + 1 = 2. And if we start somewhere, then we can expect the outcome to be a specific type of outcome. And in saying that, it's as simple as saying the proof is in the pudding, right? Now, what I love about being an advocate for Palestine and what I love about being a Palestinian is that the facts and the realities exist, right? You cannot deny a military occupation. You cannot deny restrictions on movement that are so evident, whether that be because of a tiered ID system based on your identity and where you're born, or major walls, checkpoints, heavily artillery in spaces of civilians. Those things are existent. Those things are real. And the counter side, the opposition to our message, the opposition to the message of justice, liberation, tries to hide those things. And that's when we get greenwashing and pinkwashing and so on and so forth, right? Because it needs to be covered. But the truth is there. And I, for one, lean into that. And when we talk about apartheid, all we have to do is point to those realities. So in addition to restrictions of movement, what do we see? We see restrictions to water access and other basic freedoms. Water, unequivocally, is a human right, just as the right to have shelter, right? And the right to live in security. Water is, in fact, a human right. And now Israel controls all major water sources in the West Bank specifically. Now, what does that look like? It looks like the appropriation of resources in an oppressive way. So of the major aquifer, the West Bank aquifer, Israel sends 80% of the water collected in that aquifer annually to Israeli citizens, and the other 20 gets redirected back to Palestinians. Right? So theft of resources and control of resources. It also looks like quotas on available water to Palestinians at a 30% rate less than what is recommended by the World Health Organization. So Palestinians are allocated per individual, per capita, 30% less than what is recommended by the World Health Organization because of the way that Israel appropriates water and controls the water resources in the area. It also looks like obstruction of Palestinian development and destruction of existing infrastructure, existing water infrastructure. And there was, back in 2011, Israel demolished approximately 89 various pieces of water infrastructure across the West Bank so that they can control water and water allocation in the region. I mentioned the tiered ID system, or the tiered system based on your identity, number 1, and 2, where you were born. So it looks like restrictions on movement, restrictions on access to resources, and it looks like standard legal policy, like ID cards. Also, like 50 laws on the books in Israel, over 50 laws, explicitly discriminating against Palestinians. Like there's a law in 48 Palestine, in what's recognized as Israel today, that in particular regions can be deemed Jewish only, so not for Palestinians. So that is discrimination against Palestinians in 48 Palestine, historic Palestine. For Palestinians in the West Bank, what that looks like is segregated bus lines, segregated roads, based on your identity, which is tailored to what? Serving illegal Zionist settlements in the West Bank, right? They want exclusive access, and by having, in order to dictate exclusive access, the means of access needs to be exclusive also, right? And then, unfortunately, Gaza, the worst situation of all, where it is a open-air prison where people are not allowed to leave or enter, and are forced to deal with decades of trauma and destruction, and then subsequent assaults on, or continuous assaults on Gaza. Whether that be in 2008, 2012, 2014, or even the quote-unquote smaller ones, which is so frustrating to say, because the scale, the spectrum on which the scale can be is so large that even the most aggressive actions are seen as small, right? And the psychology of it is interesting if anybody here is a psychology major, right? There are so many ways to come at this. And then finally, for refugees and their descendants, it looks like denial to the ancestral homeland, their ancestral right of return. Because I myself am a Palestinian son of immigrants, and I hold on to my right of return, and nobody can take that from me, right? So it depends on who you are and where you were born, on what laws apply to you, how you are treated. Fundamentally, that is apartheid. There's no denying that. And the importance of naming apartheid and settler colonialism is very simple. Palestinians deserve justice. We are entitled to live in health and prosperity. And to name apartheid isn't only to be, to name it, but also to speak for Palestinians. So by naming apartheid and settler colonialism and acknowledging it, we're speaking for Palestinians. And that is why it needs to be named first and foremost. And in saying that, we know what settler colonialism, late-stage settler colonialism looks like. You know, we'd be remiss if we'd be sitting here talking about Zionism and settler colonialism and not acknowledging that we are on the land of native peoples, that we are on the land of the Lenape people. And that is who was on this land and who was removed for all of us to be here. Systems of oppression are connected. And we as movements are constantly growing and learning. And also naming it doesn't just help Palestinians, but it helps other oppressed peoples, so that we as a movement are aware, are constantly learning, and are ready to address any issue, any oppressive matter that comes up.
Thank you, Wassim. That was a very helpful kind of grounding of what Israeli apartheid really looks like, and outlining that is helpful after folks saw the presentation that the SJP students gave us of the historical and contemporary reality of Palestine. I also appreciate you mentioning solidarity movements and mentioning, and acknowledging that this is a settler colonial state also that we are on, and indigenous land we are on. And whenever we are thinking and talking and advocating about Palestine, we are also keeping in mind all the other communities that unfortunately are being subjected to similar systems.
So or we'd be making a mistake.
Exactly. So thank you, Wassim. That was a very helpful kind of grounding start to our panel. And that language is important. I think that's the main thing I want to emphasize too, right? Like Wassim said, we have to know what to name it so that we know how to properly advocate for it and how to confidently do that, especially as we're seeing a lot of new definitions. That is going to be another conversation, maybe another panel that we can have. So now I want to ask a question for Dov. Can you kind of explain to us what does it mean, both literally and figuratively, to invest in Israeli apartheid, and what companies are complicit in that right now?
So, Sana, is this when I can use the computer? Should I come?
Yeah, you can go ahead to the computer. So we're going to have some visual learning too, which is great.
Hello? Thank you so much. Yeah, I get to see you from down here. So, 2007, I was active with the anti-occupation movement in what is called Israel. And I was part of an organization called the Coalition of Women for Peace. And we were trying to respond to the call of Palestinian civil society for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And it was kind of complicated because we were an Israeli organization. How can we boycott ourselves? And one of the first steps that we have identified is maybe we should look at corporations. We all agreed that corporations were stabilizing the occupation, the apartheid, the settler colonialism, that we as activists on the ground needed to know which corporations were involved so we can maybe try and move them. So this is when we started our research into who profits from the occupation. And that group has become an independent research center. You should check it out. It's called whoprofits.org, Who Profits from the Occupation. This is the foremost expert organization that exposes these companies. It is led by young Palestinian women inside 48 that work, I think they are very, very courageous. They work in very difficult conditions. And there isn't any other reliable source of information on the web. There is a lot of stupid information. But if you want good information, this is where you go. When I moved to the US about 10 years ago, I started working with the Good Quakers in the American Friends Service Committee. And we published this website, investigate.info. Check it out. And let me show you some of the things you can do here. We use the information from Who Profits and we expand on it. We try and look into companies involved in specific human rights violations as part of the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights. But also into companies that are involved in mass incarceration here in the US, or in the detention of immigrants, or in the militarization of the US-Mexico border, or in surveillance, ICE surveillance across the country. So we're trying to make these connections because these are some of the same technologies, these are some of the same corporations. We've also expanded it to look at the military-industrial complex. So if you want some of the definitions, you can look here. The settlement industry. Israeli settlements in the West Bank are illegal by international law, so companies that build them or promote them or sustain them are actively breaking international law. Exploitation of natural resources, I think Wassim discussed some of it with water, but there is a lot more. Anything that can be stolen is stolen. Palestine does not have diamonds, but it has water and it has aggregates and it has land and it has sun. Even the sun is stolen for solar energy fields. Wall and checkpoints, which is part of the whole section of the database that deals with the control of population, how to control large population, which is the same on the border, which is the same by ICE in the US, which is the same in other occupied territories, the same technologies. A lot of it now is very high tech. Weapons and military, which focuses on war crimes and attacks on civilians and collective punishment of large populations, which is also a tool of control. And finally, we've added discrimination, because we're talking about apartheid. So discrimination in the map of services that the company provides. They would provide their services to Israeli settlers, but not to their Palestinian neighbors. Discrimination in labor, in the way they treat their workers, Palestinian workers versus Israeli workers. And also discrimination just in the legal situation that companies actually profit from. They can benefit from it. I'll give you more examples. But this is just a big map. I want to say that this year we're launching a new campaign which is called Apartheid Free. So you want Rutgers University to be apartheid free. We can see that as also apartheid free cities or apartheid free congregations for religious congregations, apartheid free campuses. And for that, we're going to expand this database and look into more categories of exploitation. Companies involved in marriage discrimination and restrictions, all sorts of restrictions of civil liberties in the country. Movement restrictions, marriage restrictions, educational restrictions, labor restrictions. All of these restrictions, it doesn't matter if it's in 48 or in the occupied territory, all of them. Companies actually are known as like high-tech companies that would not hire Palestinian programmers because they use an excuse of like they don't have a high enough security clearance to work with the military, things like that. So we will expand this, but for now, you can use this database to look for a specific company, if you want, IBM. So Wassim mentioned the ID system, which is the basis of all apartheid systems. You need to be able to tell people apart. In South Africa, there was a huge campaign against Polaroid during South African apartheid. This was the first big campaign, the first big boycott in the US was against Polaroid because Polaroid helped produce the IDs that were used to determine people's rights under apartheid in South Africa. Same thing here with IBM. IBM is actually managing the Israeli population registry, which is tiered, which is stratified by religion and by nationality. Everybody is required to carry an ID. These IDs are produced through that system. It also controls the people in Gaza, because the Gaza population registry is also managed by Israel. This is all part of the same database, IBM. So this is just one example. I'll give you just one more example. You can look for a mutual fund here. And let me put the infamous Vanguard. Vanguard. I think I wrote it correctly. These are the mutual funds that are run by Vanguard. And in fact, Rutgers is invested in 3 of them, as far as we know, as of last year. And if we look for one of them that they are invested in, where is it? I just looked at it with some of the students earlier today. Why Command Shift? No. I just don't remember. I don't remember the name. What was it? Give me a moment. If any of you were in the meeting this afternoon, you should remember the name of that fund. Vinix. Where is Vinix? Can you see Vinix? VI. VI comes after VA. Not. Here it is, Vinix. Okay, so Rutgers is invested in Vinix. And if you go here, you will see what Vinix is invested in. They're invested in 28 companies that are on our occupation database. And if you scroll down, you can actually see them. And if the company has a little exclamation mark next to its name, it means this is a company we recommend for divestment. Boeing, you know what Boeing does. They make weapons. General Dynamics, another weapons company. L3 Harris, another weapons company. Lockheed Martin, another weapons company. Northrop Grumman, another weapons company. And Caterpillar, of course, which is a company that sells earth-moving equipment. Sounds very benign, but actually the Israeli military systematically buys huge D9s that are militarized and that are fortified as military weapons that are systematically used against civilians to destroy houses, to destroy civilian infrastructure, to go in front of the troops as they invade Lebanon or as they invade Gaza, and to bury people under the rubble. So this is what it means to be invested in apartheid. And what does it mean to divest from apartheid? Now that's harder, because in order to do that, we need to track our own accountability. So I just want to say one more word, which is many times when we think of divestment, we take what I call the clean hands approach. I don't want to have anything to do with these crimes over there. They are awful. I don't want to be invested in them. I don't want to buy those products. I don't want them at my home. Now I'm clean. But you're not. I'm an Israeli citizen. Many of you are American citizens. You're not. The other approach is, how am I connected to that? How am I connected to that because I'm a student of this university and this university is invested in these companies? How am I connected to that because I pay taxes and the US is sending all these weapons to Israel? How am I connected to that because I buy those products and this company is actually building settlements over there? And I should track all of these connections so I can actually use each and every one of them to make a difference. Wherever I'm connected to it, this is where I can actually take action. This is where my agency is to influence whatever is going on. And because there is a chance that I can influence it, I have to. This is a moral imperative. That's what divestment means.
Thank you for that. You kind of transitioned us perfectly into the next questions I had, but what I really appreciate about this as a tool and a visual, physical tool that you can have is a lot of times when we have conversations about apartheid and divestment and settler colonialism and these very big and heavy realities, it feels depressing almost, right? That it feels like there's nothing we can do. We feel very disconnected. We feel defeated. But tools like this actually make it less abstract and give us something tangible. Like, okay, I can start here. I can understand this here. So I really appreciate these tools. There's many tools like this one, and I really encourage you all to take a look at them, do some research, and the SJPs and all of us are always here to help with that. So thank you so much for making that a little less abstract and more tangible for us to think about. So my next question is for David, which we kind of start transitioning into well. What does divestment mean? So, and we've, Dov already started us off a little bit, but what is BDS and what did it look like historically and what could it look like present day?
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. Nice to see so many folks here tonight. And thanks to SJP and the Endowment Justice Collective and the great speakers on the panel. So boycott is we say BDS, but really it's a boycott campaign that has been a tactic that social justice movements have used for a long time. I can think of 3 off the top of my head that I have some connection with myself, either hearing about them or participating in them. The first, and I'm curious how many of you know this, I'm assuming a lot of you do, but how many of you know about the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 1956? So almost most of you, right? The idea there was in the Jim Crow South, there was a bus company that forced black folks to sit at the back of the bus, and there was a boycott campaign in 1955, 1956, to tell people do not ride that bus company until they stop what they're doing. One of the first political campaigns I got involved in was the United Farm Workers boycott in California. I'm just curious, do any of you know that? Not as many. That was started I think in about 1965, and that was for the largely Filipino and Mexican farm workers who were grievously exploited in the Central California Valley. And that focused on 2 things you were not supposed to buy: green table grapes and iceberg lettuce. And I got to tell you, until I was about 46, I could not eat a grape or iceberg lettuce because it was so burned in my mind we weren't supposed to eat those things, right? And the third boycott campaign was the boycott of apartheid South Africa. It started in 1959 and went all the way through to 1990 when the regime was toppled. And that boycott campaign played a big role in toppling that apartheid regime. And what all these boycott campaigns have in common is they seek to punish perpetrators of injustice with economic pain until they stop perpetrating injustice, right? That's the point of a boycott campaign. So a boycott campaign is very practical, saying we are going to take these steps to force you to stop doing what you're doing, whether you're a company or a regime, right? Now, boycott campaigns, though, also have a or an equally important role that they do that goes way beyond the practical economic pain that they cause. And that is they draw attention to an injustice that oftentimes is ignored, hidden, suppressed, not talked about, right? So some people knew about what was happening, the exploitation of farm workers in the Central California Valley, but the boycott campaign really brought that into the consciousness of people in this country, to many people in this country. Similarly, the Montgomery bus boycott, that really helped, was so generative in the civil rights movement, which then became one of the major social justice movements of our time. And apartheid South Africa, the boycott movement there, showed a light on it, put the laser light onto the injustice that was happening. And the same thing is happening with the BDS campaign against the apartheid Israeli regime. Now, when I was your guys' age, when I was growing up, most people in this country could say, and honestly say, they did not know a lot about what was going on in Palestine. Why? Because the mainstream media and the mainstream political spaces didn't talk about it. It was never discussed. And to the degree it was discussed, it was always told from the point of view that there's this innocent country called Israel, and they're surrounded by all these people. It was framed in what we would now call blatantly racist terminology, right? They're surrounded by all these angry, hostile Arab people who just hate Jews, right? That was what we were told growing up. No one ever asked, why are they resisting you? Why would that be happening? What are you doing to them that is making them resist you? That was never discussed. And two things happened that really changed that. The first, and you guys will relate to this, was the explosion of digital technology and social media, right? There came a time with digital video and then social media to share digital video where anybody with a cell phone camera could start showing what was happening in their lives, right? As you guys can, right? We all can on social media now. People didn't know in this country. They weren't told about the Nakba, which was we were introduced to, the massive campaign of ethnic cleansing, Zionist ethnic cleansing in 1948. People weren't told. I mean, well, they were a little bit. It made the New York Times a little bit about the massacres in the Shabra and Shatila refugee camps when the Israeli army invaded Lebanon, surrounded the camps, allowed the Lebanese militias to go into the camps and slaughter people. It made the New York Times a couple, below the fold, as they say, right, at the bottom end of the paper. But nobody was held accountable, really. Nobody really talked about it. Why? Because there wasn't the video, there wasn't the social media to spread around the world viral images of these atrocities, right? But that's all changed. The other thing that has changed the whole narrative has been the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions that started in 2005. And it's done that not only, again, by calling for economic sanctions against the apartheid regime, but it's done something even more or equally important to that. It has clarified what the nature of the problem is. And how many of you know, if I asked you what are the 3 basic demands of the boycott, divestment, and sanction platform, how many of you know what those are? Okay, good. So we're going to learn some stuff today. So there's 3 basic calls in the BDS call. The first is an end to the 1967 occupation. The second is full equality for Palestinians who live under the apartheid regime inside, as you heard Wassim say, 1948 Palestine, right, which they call Israel, but is 1948 Palestine, and the right of return for the hundreds of thousands of refugees and their descendants who were brutally and violently ethnically cleansed in 1948 to return to their homeland and their homes, right? And what that has done is it has shown that the problem is not just to the degree that this issue was discussed decades ago. It was only talked about in terms of the 1967 occupation. And the idea was if we can just get Israel to pull out of the West Bank, then we can have, then there'll be peace and 2 peoples can coexist together side by side. But what the BDS campaign has exposed is the lie of that. The problem is not just the West Bank occupation. It's not just the checkpoints and all the things that Wassim went into great detail about. Those are a huge problem. They're not the only problem. What the BDS movement has shown is that the problem is the presence of a racist, settler, colonial, Zionist regime. Doesn't matter whether that regime is on 100% of Palestine or 10% of Palestine. And by way of analogy, if you think it's okay if it's only on part of Palestine, that's like in the civil rights movement saying, okay, look, we'll end Jim Crow, right? We'll end those racist policies in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. But we're going to keep them in Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. Nobody would have accepted that. The idea was the whole regime had to collapse. Same thing with South Africa. Nobody said, well, you can practice apartheid in this part of South Africa and in that part of South Africa, but in these parts here, you won't be able to do it. The idea was, I'll finish up in 1 second. The idea was that the whole regime had to be toppled. And I just want to make one last point, that the success of BDS in exposing the problems of a Zionist regime have been the success has been so large that look what defenders and enablers of the apartheid regime have had to do. They've had to pass anti-BDS laws in 33 states, including New Jersey. And many of you may have been subjected to this yourselves. They have had to resort to accusing anybody who speaks up for Palestinian liberation as an anti-Semite, as someone who hates Jewish people, even like me, if you're Jewish, right? And why are they doing that? Because they can't answer. They can't defend the indefensible. And when you can't defend the indefensible, you have two options. You either have to stop defending the indefensible, or you have to shut up everybody else who's pointing out the injustice to the rest of the world. And that is what's behind this campaign to brand everybody as anti-Semitic who speaks up for Palestine and to pass all these laws. And those laws are horrible, and being accused of being anti-Semitic is horrible. But it's also a sign of weakness, not strength. And it means that someday soon, we're going to see the toppling of the apartheid regime in Palestine as we did in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That does deserve a clap. Yeah, there's like some hope that you gave us. I think just even, you taking us through some historical connections to other movements is inspiring, and it bridges natural solidarity. So I appreciated your answer. And it also kind of, again, makes divestment feel like something that isn't too far out, but is something that actually, that we know, right, as you said, is working and will get us to a free Palestine.
I went over my time. I apologize.
It's okay. There's so much good stuff to say, so it's fine. I have a question for Iman. Iman, can you tell us some of the different strategies, either on a university or legislative level, to push divestment campaigns? And USCPR does such great work, so can you share some examples of USCPR campaigns that are relevant here?
All right, I think it's on. So I do need to start off by saying, I do think that this turnout is absolutely phenomenal. I come from a university I graduated in, I hate to admit, about 8 years ago, where no one would have ever showed up to an event like this. There was no SJP chapter. There was no Palestinian presence aside from maybe myself and one other person. And so for you all to show up despite Zionist backlash, despite the fear of being blacklisted, despite the fear of any sort of oppressive structure that might be put up against you, just shows and proves your resilience and strength. And I'm literally looking around, and y'all are so young, and y'all are so strong, and I'm so amazed just by everything that's been pushed out here, and to be here on a Friday night. So I appreciate that, y'all. Thanks for showing up here. And I think that one thing that I want to start off by saying is that we at USCPR are consistently trying to work with folks on the ground. So we really are always consistently looking to learn from folks like you. I think that one thing that we try to do as a national nonprofit is step in as someone who does have national resources to really uplift those local campaigns. So a campaign like this one is definitely something that we would really work hard to try to uplift, to try to bring attention to try to encourage folks to tend to in any way possible so that we can get your resolution passed. And we do need to move beyond the fossil fuel divestment, right? We don't want this university just doing what's cool, what's important to them. We're not just here to stand up on climate change and not stand up against prison systems, mass incarceration, illegal occupation. We're here to do it all, and I think that you guys are all so committed to that, and so I want to shout out all of you for doing that and participating in it. And you really are standing on the shoulders of giants. There are so many universities who have stood up and done this, right? You see this to the day. I mean, let's even point out the Harvard Crimson editorial board putting out their article on BDS and all the backlash that they got this past year, and yet they still move forward on it, and we saw that. I think that even going back all the way to 2016, you had Manchester University, you had Portland State University, Evergreen State, University of California pushing for those divestment policies and getting things passed. Now, I do apologize. I may list off some things that may have been overturned, but I do think it's also really important to recognize that there has been a time dating back to even, 8 years ago at this point, 7 to 8 years ago at this point, where folks really stood up and decided that this was important to them, that this was something that was possible. You have people at Tufts University who in April of 2017 passed a resolution that included companies like G4S, HP, Elbit Systems, many of the systems and companies that you saw here today in the database. And I think that there's something really beautiful to be said as well, that whenever we push for divestment policies like these, we're consistently always pairing them as part of a collective struggle. We're never talking about Palestine as if it's in and of itself. We're talking about the Black struggle. We're talking about the indigenous struggle here in the US. We're talking about mass incarceration. We're talking about LGBTQ plus oppression. We're doing it all. And it's really beautiful because people at Long Beach University in May 2017 actually passed a divestment resolution while also passing resolutions that encourage divestment from companies that profited off of LGBTQ oppression and private prisons. So the possibilities are absolutely endless in what we can possibly divest from. And then you have folks at the U of C who were able to divest from 10 companies, 8 of which are American. So for them to stand up and say that this is our responsibility to divest from this and get the university to actually step up and make that decision and to do these sorts of things that are not easy is absolutely amazing. And you guys are part of that. You guys are part of that trend. You're really building off of that movement. And so to see this all happening is absolutely wonderful. And I think that some of the things that we do at USCPR, actually what we have is a network of folks from all over the United States, speaking to them from within their local formations, so whether it's Seattle or the Bay Area, or if it's here in New Jersey, wherever it may be, and working really hard to uplift those local campaigns and really working to address some of the different things that you are each working on. So we'd love to have each of you as part of that network and continue a part of it. Actually, I think some of you here are a part of that network, so I just really appreciate that support and coming to us and really trusting in us to do that work. Also, we're trying our best to make sure that you're connected to other folks who are doing this work. There's so many lessons to be learned, so many things that we could teach one another. There are so many little failures along the way as well that we have been able to really overcome, and I think that you guys are pushing past all of those things and are capable of doing so much more. So I think this is just kind of going into the theme of resilience and your capabilities, and I do see such potential here happening at Rutgers, and you guys are already pushing for that. So just know we got you guys, and we got your back. We're here to support all of you, and we really want to push forward. So I think that those are just some of the things that we've seen, and we want to really continue helping support you all in.
Thank you, Iman. Thank you for your energy. You have such rejuvenating and passionate energy. I love it. And for laying out some examples, again, to make to remind us that divestment is possible, that is very possible here, and especially with the support of you and US Campaign and many other organizations. I have one more question for each panelist, and then I am conscious of time, so if we can try to keep these answers within the time frame, just so we have enough time for the Q&A. I want to take a question back to David. Can you share some examples from your work, specifically as a non-Zionist Jewish ally, with a role on this campus especially?
Well, I'm a co-founder of a group called Jews for Palestinian Right of Return, an anti-Zionist Jewish group. And let's see, we try as much as possible to center the voices of Palestinians in their liberation struggle for themselves. One of the things we've done, this is really campus related, but we do a poster campaign on our website and on the web, and we try to feature Palestinians talking about Palestinian liberation. And so we try, even though we call ourselves Jews for Palestinian Right of Return, we do that mainly so that we can help push back against the idea that this is a struggle between Palestinians and Jewish people. It's not. It's a struggle between Zionism and settler colonialism and Jewish people. So we try to do that. On campus this year, I've been involved in a couple of events here going back 11 or 12 years. I don't know how many, maybe even our panelists may know, but in 2011, there was an event on campus that the Hillel House came to and tried to disrupt, and lied and claimed that Jewish people were not being allowed into this event, which was a complete fiction. They went to the Department of Education, which investigated Rutgers University, found the university completely innocent of having sponsored any anti-Semitic event. This was 11 years ago, and then a couple of years ago, under Donald Trump, his attorney general reopened the case to try to prove that Rutgers had acted in an anti-Semitic way, and of course, it was completely rejected. So we've tried to participate as much as possible in solidarity actions with campus students, particularly those featuring Palestinian voices.
Nice. Thank you, David, for that, and for all of your work also in solidarity and support. Wassim, can you tell us where the law, specifically in New Jersey, but also nationally, stands on divestment? Are anti-BDS laws or fear-mongering campaigns legal?
Yeah.
I know you like this question.
Yeah. So the way they try, is everybody here familiar with the term lawfare? right? So it's like a concept of warfare, but instead of warfare, it's lawfare. So using the law as a means of aggression, as a means of intimidation, as a means of limiting people's ability to function, right? Because legal practice in this country is expensive. Legal action in this country is expensive. It requires a lot of money. So that's exactly what it is, right? So like I said, the realities in the truth lie with us in our movement. Right? And so when we look at the way anti-BDS legislation is used across the country, it's largely, in my opinion, very symbolic. Symbolic, and then in ways that it's not symbolic, we've seen it fail, and I'll touch on that in a moment. We referenced multiple times on the stage the existing anti-BDS law in the state of New Jersey. So in 2015, it was introduced and passed in 2016. It was anti-BDS legislation in the state of New Jersey, and what it does is essentially if any company, any corporation, private company that the state invests in its pension funds. Let me rephrase. Any state pension funds invested in a company that engages in boycott of Israel will be withdrawn. And so the thing is that didn't really exist. There weren't any companies who the state was investing in that was at the time that was that was engaging in a boycott. Right, we've seen Ben & Jerry's is now an issue being discussed, and it's an issue that's kind of playing out. In the state, advocates in the state have been looking for the perfect, I'm trying to think outside of legal terms, aggrieved party, looking for somebody who was hurt by this law so they can sue and get the law overturned. Laws like this one and laws that are like allegiance, essentially a lot of Texas, for example, and Maryland passed laws that ultimately, like, if you hold a certain position, like in Texas as a teacher, we saw with Bahia, if you are a teacher, as a part of your employment, you have to sign a statement saying, I won't engage in boycotts of Israel, or I won't do 1, 2, 3 against Israel. Those we've seen lose in court. So if we talk about legality of a law, ironically, it's a bit of a challenging concept. It comes down to if something is passed as a law, if a bill is passed as a law, then it would have to be challenged in court, right? We have the idea of the multiple branches in our government, the checks and balances, right? So in the state of New Jersey, there is no law that exists that would affect students in this, gathering in Rutgers, the EJC and SJP and other folks from engaging in divestment or getting this university to divest from Israel. So that's the good news, right? And so, we have seen multiple attempts to make that a thing. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which is just horribly titled, Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, that we've defeated multiple times on the federal level, that ultimately was trying to vilify and criminalize activism for Palestine on college campuses specifically. And it's so creative in the way that they do this. What they tried to do is change the definition of anti-Semitism under the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So that naturally, if you're engaging in criticism of Israel, then you're doing something anti-Semitic, and you're violating the Civil Rights Act, and then funding can be withdrawn from you from the federal government, right? So it's interesting in the ways they construct these attempts at lawfare, at intimidation. And to end, I'll say that there is no law on the books federally either that affects our ability to divest and engage in BDS. Those are generally, there are 2 laws that are in effect, but those have to do with international relations and the way we deal with other countries that are engaged in divestment and boycott of Israel and or support those things.
Thank you, Wassim. And as you were talking, I was thinking of Fanon and talking about like the fear of the colonizer and like all of what you just said, all of the tools that they have to take to protect themselves from the truth because the truth exposes them. So, Wassim kind of laid out for us what's happening opposition in law here. Dov, can you take us and kind of tell us what's happening on the ground with opposition and specifically, any BDS that tries to get to, corporate to corporation. So how does anti-corporate BDS rhetoric open the door to, you know, a new wave of backlash against all types of socially responsible investment? You know, it's a big question, so.
Yeah. Let me start by saying we're talking here about federal and state legislation, we're talking about corporations and mutual funds and investment, and it all sounds very, very, very big and very, very complicated. Well, in the end of all of this, there are small communities in the Jordan Valley or in the Nakab in Palestine that are being dispossessed, that are being under attack every day by settlers, that everything they own, which is very little, is being taken away from them, and they rebuild, 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 and they rebuild hundreds of times. So I want us to remember that, because that grounds everything that we're doing here. In times of great harm to humanity, and this is one of these times, our only obligation is to stand with the people who are most oppressed, who are most under attack, who are most suffering, in resistance and also just in solidarity. So the call to divest, boycott, and sanction is just a very minimal call. You know, they're just asking us not to support the oppression. That's all. It's the minimum. So let's start with that. And then say, yeah, we have these over 50 colleges where student government have passed divestment resolutions. They are totally symbolic. We don't have one university in the United States of America where money has actually moved. Hampshire College, they moved and then they said, oh, but it wasn't BDS, it was something else. That was the only exception. Not even one university. That's shameful. And then on top of that, we have all these Israeli apologists who are running around making laws, trying to make sure that nobody even mentions the word Palestine. That's what we're talking about. They can call it anti-BDS, but it is not about BDS. None of these laws are about BDS. They are empty. They are there only to intimidate anyone who wants to speak about Palestine. That's what they're there for. They have nothing to do with BDS. They don't even know what BDS is, I have to tell you. They don't care. And now I want to tell you about something else which is quite outrageous, which is a weird coalescence between those Israel Zionist apologists who are trying to stifle all conversation on Palestine through vilifying and delegitimizing BDS, and a bigger wave of corporate power apologists that are run by the Republican Party, the mainstream Republican Party, trying to stifle all kind of activism against corporate power. And for some weird reason, these two kind of coalesced in this perfect timing together. Just like they learn about new weaponry and new technologies of control and surveillance from practicing it on Palestinians in the occupied territories, and new ideologies. They also learn about new ways to stifle free speech in the US by first trying it against Palestine activists. So we see how in Texas and two other states there are laws that are identical to anti-BDS legislation that are trying to get the state to divest from anyone who divests from fossil fuel companies or from energy companies. Same laws, exactly. And now there is a new initiative also written by ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a corporate-funded body that writes legislation for Republicans, that is now running a new law. It is called the Eliminate Political Boycotts Act. And it is a template. And you could just write in the name of the state and then run it, and Republicans will run it in all states where they can run it, which is doing the exact same thing to delegitimize and make sure that states will, or not just states, any government entity, including universities like this one, will not be able to contract with any a company that doesn't pledge to refrain from any kind of boycott including divestment, which is a boycott of investments. So we as a people are going to lose our right to do any kind of activism against large agro-business or against surveillance companies or against any kind of company using that same tactic. So I'll just say one more word. I saw the sign that says my time is up. Thank you. Which is, that means this is about Palestine, but it is not only about Palestine. It's asking our university to have a responsible endowment which invests in our well-being and in our communities and not in the harm and destruction of those is something that is in the interest of all of us.
Thank you for that answer. And your answer really helped us contextualize how state repression tools, whether in Israel or specifically in Israel and the US, speak to each other and rely on each other. So exactly what you ended us with, right? When we are talking about justice for Palestine, we're talking about justice for all people everywhere. So my last question is for Iman, if you could end us with your beautiful energy. And I do want to name that, divestment is on many campuses symbolic, but I think, but it brought all of us into this room, right? And so we can also understand, and that's kind of what we're talking about, different strategies. Divestment on this campus might be something that is more symbolic, but it's a start to some of the larger wins that we have been hearing about. So Iman, kind of on that note, how can we tackle potential future collaborations with Israel, specifically thinking about this campus or other campuses, such as research agreements and the Tel Aviv agreement that Rutgers made? How can we make sure it doesn't get renewed? And how do we keep up that hope and that momentum of divestment and similar campaigns, knowing that the U.S. and Israel are so closely linked?
Yeah, I had to take a breather. As I think about, again, all the different Zionist tactics that are used to shut us out, right, to silence us. But I think every single time that we hear of another vehicle trying to silence us, we literally pull up in tenfold. Like, my mom calls me stubborn, but I don't think I'm stubborn. I think I'm just resilient, and I just keep going. I would say the same to all of you who may have heard that from their mothers or anyone else. We're not stubborn. We're going to keep going. And I think that that's exactly what you guys are all doing here. I think that I saw that Rutgers actually also passed an IRA statement recently, and I know that the fact that it just happened, and y'all are still here, you were still committed to pulling this event together, you were still committed to making sure that this panel happened, and hosting a series of educational formats so that more people on your campus are aware of what's going on, aware of the vehicles that are being used, aware of the investments that this university are making, is absolutely profound. And so these sorts of educational opportunities are absolutely so many other people, as we understand, as Angela Davis has so wonderfully said, that our liberation is interconnected in the liberation of so many others. And so what you're doing and what you're fighting for are the people back in Palestine who are enduring the occupation, my own family dealing with the occupation as we currently speak, your families as they endure the occupation of Palestine. And I think that what we're doing from there to here is absolutely profound, and we cannot give up. And so continuing these educational programs, continuing the coalitions and structures that you each develop to have every day, every week conversations about what the next step is. intervening with your student body and actually giving them an opportunity to hear from you and understanding where you're coming from is absolutely critical. And you must not give up. But I don't think I need to tell any of you that. I think you're each willing to do that and willing to fight the fight until it's over with. And I think that you are fully committed to that even beyond your time here on campus, as we do need folks even focusing on other institutions as well. But I think those are just some of the things, and it sounds like you all each are very well aware of that. And just, again, I can't stand here and talk about the different wins without acknowledging the number of people who have been put forth, who have been, really attacked, who have been withheld from, potential jobs, but have really pulled through and succeeded in all that they've done. And so you are all each a part of that population of people moving forward.
Thank you, Iman, for that. That was a beautiful way to end. If you all can help me thank all of our panelists for their great answers and for their motivation and energy in being here. I know that we have a couple audience questions, so I'm going to transition us into those. And again, if you all have any other questions, if we have time for all of them, you can use that QR code to submit them. So our first question is for Wassim, but if anyone else would like to answer after, please feel free to. One of the panelists mentioned pinkwashing. How is the current plight of the Palestinian LGBTQIA community? If you are able to speak on that.
Yeah, that's tough for me to speak on.
Yeah,
I think that's tough for me to speak on. I don't know.
Does anyone else on the panel? So the question, someone mentioned pinkwashing. So the question was to elaborate on the current plight of Palestinian LGBTQIA+ communities.
So obviously I'm not Palestinian, but I am a lesbian. I've worked for some time in Palestine with two of the most impressive organizations that I've ever seen, Al-Qaus and, sorry, it's my menopause forgetting name. What is the name of the organization in Haifa of women? Aswat. Al-Qaus and Aswat. So there is representation, there are organizations, you can look online, you can support them, they are doing amazing work. The thing about pinkwashing is that traditionally Israel presented itself as a safe haven for Palestinians running away from conservative setups. And as you probably can imagine, the situation is quite different. One of the reasons why queer Palestinians cannot move to the big city to build big and free queer cultural communities in many times is the occupation, is the restriction of movement by the occupation. And so many times when Palestinians are trying to get away from restrictive or harmful situations, they find it really hard. And the Israeli occupation actually exploits that to its own benefit by putting pressure on young people who are in dire situations to become informants. They do not want to become informants. These are some of the more extreme situations that we know of over the years. It is no longer as it used to be. This used to be kind of an issue that we dealt with in the organizations quite often. It is no longer the case because of the strength of the LGBTQ Palestinian community today, because it is now organized and there are more support systems that we didn't have before. But I really encourage you to go online and support these fabulous organizations.
Yeah, those organizations do some good work. Thank you for that answer. My next question says for Iman. I like how you all specified. I like it. When oppression targets those with intersectional identities, we see that those voices are increasingly suppressed. So with that said, on the similar note, what can we do to help amplify the voices of queer Palestinian people and make sure that people are not spreading or speaking over them?
I think we need to be intentional in the language that we use, whether it's in the formations or the divestment policies that we put forth. I think being very intentional about those multiple identities that folks carry, the multiple oppressions, or the accentuated oppression that folks deal with because of the intersection of their own identities. I know that one thing that I consistently do in my organizing itself is actually throughout the coalition spaces as part of just common ground rules is we make sure that we're very intentional about who's included and making sure that folks are being heard. And I think that intentionality goes such a long way. So making sure that folks are centered, making sure that people are included, making sure that we have a safe space for people is really important. And we can do that through the language that we use through those policies, or even in the formations that we have on the ground, whether it's on campus or beyond. So that would be my simple answer to that question.
Yeah, I think that speaks like all intersecting identities, so thank you for that. David, if you can help us answer, as a non-Palestinian, how can I be a true ally to the cause against Israeli apartheid?
Well, I suppose that's the same you would ask about any movement where you don't identify yourself as part of as belonging to the oppressed community, but you're in solidarity with them. And I think it's the things that our panelists have already spoken about to the previous two questions, making sure being intentional about whose voices are centered, being intentional about how you behave in spaces and how you show solidarity. And solidarity, the idea of solidarity is that you're not just doing it like because you're a nice person and you feel bad for others. I mean, that's a good thing to feel, and we should feel that empathy. You're doing it because you recognize the liberation of all people is dependent on being in solidarity with oppressed people. That none of us nobody's going to be liberated from this increasingly disastrous looking planet. I mean, I don't mean to strike a down note at the end of this great event. But, there's a lot to be really concerned about. And so if we want to survive, we have to show solidarity with each other, and that means starting with the people who are the most oppressed and the most denied and centering their voices.
Thank you, David. That was a beautiful answer. And I'm going to take a couple more questions just to be mindful of everyone's times, but I do want to encourage you all to come up, if the panelists are comfortable, and ask them questions on a personal level too. Wassim, this one was not specified for you, but I know that you've worked a lot with SJP students on this campus, so I would love to hear your answer for this. What tactics can we use to push for divestment when our own schools don't listen to their students?
Hey, so is anybody here familiar with the concept of power mapping? Right? Power mapping is critical, especially in a situation where you're finding yourself being like, well, they're not going to listen to me. Okay, cool. Who's in your corner? Who can we, what's the word I'm looking for? Who can we bring into the fold that can help elevate your voices? You know what I mean? There's the idea of going beyond this campus and getting wide community outrage. That's one way to do it. Familiarizing yourself, honestly, trying to get your hands on a donor list. Is there anybody on a donor list at the top possibly that would be down? You know what I mean? That is for the struggle, that is part of a struggle, that is amenable to your message. You know what I mean? So power mapping is a critical concept, and it can get you a lot of places, and it allows you to be very strategic and intentional and identify where your strong points are and how to address your possible weak points. So I think that is a tool that can help students on campus. That is a tool that I'm currently using for a project that I'm working on that I feel is very difficult to overcome and accomplish, but it needs to be done, and with the work, it can be done.
Yeah, of course.
So I think many of you are probably familiar with Shireen Abu Akleh, and she passed away, she was murdered by Israel a little over 6 months ago now. And the United States is finally opening up an independent investigation into her murder, despite the fact that there have been multiple reports out there claiming and showing us and substantiating the fact that it was, in fact, an Israeli bullet that killed her. And I remember when Lina Abu Akleh, her, I believe it's her cousin or niece, who came to the United States, wasn't given an answer shortly after her murder, and still decided that she was going to do a tour and meet with delegates week after week after week, demanding that someone open up an investigation and substantiate what we all already knew. And I understand that sometimes with these sorts of oppressive forces down on our backs, we want to give up. And I say to you all that when you feel defeated, you stand back and you take a moment to rest, but remember that you are fully capable of actually pushing past those structures. And I mentioned Shireen because here we are, we're dealing with the murder of a journalist, a world-renowned journalist, and no one wanted to open up an investigation on her and her murder. And it happened. Now, I don't necessarily know how far that investigation will go, but we know that it finally happened. And just in the same way as you're pushing for those divestment policies, I do truly believe that at the end of the day, we are all working towards the exact same thing, and that's bringing integrity and value back into Palestinian life and reminding ourselves that we are worthy, that we are worthy, that we are worthy.
Thank you, Iman. There's no way to follow that, so thank you. Dov, can you talk to us about maybe the limitations of divestment, and if Rutgers divests, how do we put more pressure on Israel and keep that momentum going?
I would say the opposite. I would say that we said earlier it's only symbolic, but I want to say it is symbolic. So even if in the next couple of years we don't get Rutgers to divest, but we do get a lot of the people on campus to know what it is invested in. Mm-hmm. And we get a lot of the people in New Jersey to know that there is an ethical demand here for ethical investments, and that there is a law that says that this is not okay for some reason. There is a stupid law like that. It is not ethical. If we get more people across the country to take up the same fabulous research that you guys are doing and the same information packets that you're creating and present it to their school administration, this is something that many people in power and organizations in power notice. I want to say that divestment is really not an economic tool. It is a symbolic tool. And your adversary in this campaign is not the administration of Rutgers University. They are your allies. You're asking them to be better. You want to help them become better. What we are trying to do is to get those companies out of Palestine, because they bring the power of money and political influence into these structures of oppression. We want to withdraw them from Palestine. When we actually say divest, what we're asking for is for these corporations to divest from Israeli apartheid, not for Rutgers to divest from them. This is something to remember. And we as a movement have been successful in getting dozens and dozens and dozens of large international corporations to divest from Israel altogether or from Israeli apartheid specifically, using those methods. It's not about the university actually divesting. It's about your tenacity and the voice that you raise and the ability that you have to be heard despite all these attempts to silence us, to create that kind of controversy that corporations cannot take. And they withdraw, because corporations are chicken shit. Because they care only about money, nothing else. So this is our job, to create a risk. They are very risk averse. They hear that there might be some future potential risk to their bottom line, and they run away. And that's what we want them to do. And they keep doing that. So this is why we keep succeeding in those divestment campaigns. Because all we need to do is to stay there. Just keep at it.
Thank you for that. That's like a new phrase. I think we can use corporations or chicken shit. This is for anyone who would like to answer, who has input. How do we talk about divestment with our friends on campus and beyond? How can we as students change minds, especially the minds of Zionists?
Do you care how your money is being spent? Do you care, sorry for jumping in, but like this is as simple as that, a message of, does it matter to you what your day-to-day affects other people around the world? You know what I mean? That's just the start of the conversation.
Anyone else? You don't have to, but if you want to.
I can add. Mm-hmm. I think this is a time, I think, in this country, not just, for the Palestine movement. Just like the Republicans have their vision for a new financial system that absolutely is unlawful for it to even take any kind of other considerations but the bottom line, it's time for a vision for progressives in this country for a new financial system that centers people and not profits. And that's something that I think should appeal to most people on campus, saying The university has billions of dollars in investment. They should be invested in us. This is not even about Palestine. They should be invested in us, in our communities, in our well-being, and not in Wall Street altogether. And if it is in Wall Street, it should be in companies in Wall Street that promote our well-being. And divest from all the companies that create harm in the world. Yes, from human rights violators and from war profiteers, yes, all of them. It's not about divestment, it's about investment in us. We deserve the fruits of our public funds.
So going off of that, Dov, this question was for you. What is the role and importance of labor unions and labor militancy? And David, if you would like to also jump in on this in regards to divestment organizing on the corporate level.
Go ahead.
Well, in the past, with the anti-apartheid movement, South African apartheid, the labor movement has been central to anti-apartheid. And we're building an anti-apartheid movement in this country today. And I think the labor movement around Palestine is far behind, and it's hard to get them on board. We see the beginning of some great initiatives, usually relationships with Zionist trade unions. It's one of the challenges for our movement.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that. It is difficult. The labor movement, the official labor movement in this country, has been pro-Zionist for a long time, although that has started to change. Over the last couple of years in particular, unions have a smaller number, but nevertheless significant episodes where unions have taken stands in support of Palestine. I'm a member of the adjunct faculty union here at Rutgers, and last year the executive board of the union voted to put out a statement in response to a call from Palestinian labor organizations, calling on labor unions around the world to support the struggle for justice in Palestine. And our executive board put out a statement in support of that. But that's, you know, I don't want to oversell it and say that everywhere you look, labor unions are rushing to support Palestine. They have traditionally been very pro-Zionist. But as I say, there is certainly evidence that that is starting to change. And, you know, I think that it's the way history works. A lot of times the culture is here, it's here, it's here, it's saying no, no, no. Then things suddenly shift, and people who used to say no start to think about things differently. The shifting pressures in the culture coming from below force people to reevaluate, and they shift and they move over in progressive directions. There would have been a time where if you had said, hey, you know, do you think women are ever going to get the right to vote in this country? People would have said, are you crazy? Women don't vote. What are you talking about? But then there was a suffrage movement. There was pressure put on it. And now it seems self-evident that that's the case. And there's a great quote, I forget who was it, it's from one of the a German philosopher, Schnitzler or somebody, said something. What, do you guys know the quote? Oh, the name Schnitzler, okay. Funny, I suppose. To us, maybe not to him, but he said something to the effect of, how did he put it? That all truth goes through three phases. First, it is ridiculed, then it is violently attacked, then it is held to be self-evident. Right, so first they laugh at you, then when you start getting powerful, they attack you, and then at a certain point goes, well, of course that's true, right? So there's hope that the struggle for Palestinian liberation will go through the same thing. It's been laughed at, it's been ridiculed, it has been violently attacked, and hopefully there will be a day where people go, well, of course Palestine should be. Hopefully there'll be a day where you can say, free Palestine from the river to the sea, and nobody does anything but go, yeah, of course, that sounds right.
I'll just say very briefly that within the labor movement, there are the workers, right? In my bio, at the very start of my bio, I intentionally list that I'm a grassroots-oriented advocate because it always comes back down to the grassroots. It always comes down to the fundamental, the foundation. And I'll give you an example. There's a dock in Elizabeth, New Jersey, shout out to Oakland, Block the Boat. Tova, my favorite, is in the front row. So we got, in Jersey, we got the message from Oakland that they were going to bring goods to the dock in Elizabeth. And it happened about 3 times. And each time we go out, we picket. And while we're picketing and walking around and chanting and yelling, the workers always come to the fence. They always come to the fence and they ask us, what are you doing? And we get the opportunity to speak to the workers. And while the dock is obviously on the other side, I don't think dock is the right word, but it is on the other side. We're on the street side, they're on like the river side or whatever it may be. So we can't actively stop it, but we're getting to the workers. We're having conversations with the workers. So within the labor movement, there are the workers. And when we build grassroots-oriented and we speak to people, we educate, we learn, we grow, and we see effects like David was saying we see.
Can I jump in with one thing? That was great, Wassim, and that is when I said that there hasn't been union support, I'm talking about the union leadership of the big unions, at people at the top of the pyramid. But Wassim is right. There's a big distinction between the people at the very top of the pyramid and the grassroots people actually doing the labor. And some of them are much more receptive to struggles for justice than their well-paid bosses at the top of the union who just want to basically preserve their power.
Yeah.
Unions are too big.
Thank you both for that. I think that's a great reminder of the power of the masses and mobilizing masses and talking to people and everyone around you. So I'm going to shift, Iman, since you brought up Angela Davis, I would like to ask you this question. What is the connection to Palestinian oppression and the prison industrial complex here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, we can't even, I think one thing that we didn't do today, but it's because it wasn't necessarily a point of focus, is that we are literally able to talk about Palestine in the way that we have because of the Black liberation movement here in the United States, right? Like even 2020 protests, right? Like what many of you have probably been a part of, stood up on, has literally helped shift the movement around Palestine in such a tremendously beautiful way. And so we know that we have to consistently thank the folks who are already experiencing the oppression by the US structures here, specifically Black people in the United States, for the amount of visibility we even have on Palestine and for the influences and for the political opinion changing on Palestine. And so for me, it's a lot about, I cannot even talk about the Palestinian prisoners without talking about the number of political prisoners, number of prisoners here overall held in U.S. prison industrial complex, and they just go hand in hand. Like it would be such a missed opportunity. It wouldn't be right. And for me, as someone who philosophically believes this is a shared struggle, I just cannot even center the oppression of Palestinians without centering the oppression of folks who are white within me, who are standing alongside me, who are consistently around us and facing the police violence, the state-sanctioned violence, the mass incarceration, as we've spoken of a few times now today. And so I think they just go hand in hand. I think these are the same systems. I mean, there are many systems that are actually literally happening from the US to Palestine that are around the prison and complex industrial system. I'm flipped up.
We just don't like it.
Let's not talk about it.
We just don't like it.
But I think that if some of you may have never heard of this, but there's the Deadly Exchange Program that's actually, that exists outside of Israel, that actually sends like police programs and surveillance technologies and basically new techniques for folks to use here, specifically other police agencies to use here in the US on Black and brown communities. And we've seen that time and time again, and we're consistently, actually there's a Deadly Exchange Program to try and end the programs themselves from actually being able to fully flush themselves out here, as we are working towards also bringing attention to the ending, to defunding the police here, right? Like I think it's actually really great that we've been talking about divestment, because I think I've actually thought a lot about defunding the police as we've been thinking about the invest-divest structure as well, and like thinking about what do we actually want to invest our money in? Like where do we want to take this society? Where do we really want to go? And I think ending all prison systems is like part of that, like decolonizing my mind and thinking about what's ahead for us.
Yeah. Thank you, Iman, for
Can I
that.
jump in with one just quick point?
Of course.
You know, to this notion of Black and Palestinian solidarity, the first spaces that were really overtly supportive of the Palestinian liberation struggle were in the 1960s in the Black Power movement. That was, so, you know, there has historically been that connection. And I think that's a great point, that we can't talk about Palestinian liberation without talking about Black liberation. And in fact, during the Ferguson uprisings, there were messages being sent from Palestine, you know, to the rebellions in Ferguson, noting that connection, and vice versa. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think there was a question around, like, how do we talk about it with our friends? And I think that Palestine itself is not necessarily, I don't like to use the word complicated, because I don't actually think it's complicated to understand. I don't think there's anything complicated about apartheid. I think it's pretty straightforward. We don't have to dilute it. We don't have to talk about it in a different way. But there is a way of actually using the language that we're using in the with the anti-Black racism struggle here in the United States, and actually bridging this understanding when it comes to what we understand here in the US. And there's lots of language. Like, I love that we're actually using settler colonialism more often when we're talking about the US systems. I think it really helps bridge out this understanding around what's going on in Palestine, and it allows people to not turn a blind eye to it anymore. I think that the more that we use language like white supremacy when we talk about Zionism is really critical. We need to make sure that people understand it from the angle of which they understand it here. So there's language. Language is so important when it comes to also sharing it out, because you're more likely to get people to actually hear you when you're using the same language that they already understand.
Yeah, I want to say, and you all answered beautifully in the short time that we have, but this on its own, right, this question on its own is usually like an hour and a half, 2-hour workshop. So I really want to encourage you all also to do more research. So many of our orgs, AMP, U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, the nonprofit I work at, we all on our website have a lot of great tools and classes and ways, or even offering individual workshops to keep these conversations going. So I loved seeing that question, and I'm happy that these are the conversations that are generating in your minds. I have a couple more questions. One, this next one, and speaking of white supremacy, you transitioned us into it well. It's specified for David, but anyone can feel free to answer. How does white supremacy influence the support apartheid Israel receives on a global approach, and how does this alienate BIPOC Palestinians in different spaces? And for those who don't know, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color.
Does anyone want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yeah. So Israel is a European outpost in the Middle East. Israel is a white supremacist effort in its inception, itself, the whole thing. And that starts with the language, like, when I graduated college in 2015, I had a statistics professor. I walked into my statistics class on May 15th, and he wrote on the board, what country, and it's the language in this question killed me. What country is roughly the size of New Jersey, leads the world in medicine, technology, and another field of innovation, but is surrounded by neighbors hell-bent on destroying it? And it's like, just the way that it's framed is like, it's the other, right? Vilifying and making people the other, making them the boogeyman, and that's centered around what is good and pure white and what is not, right? And who is for justice and democracy, and who shares these values that the United States has of justice and democracy. So Israel in its entirety is a European outpost in the Middle East. It's a strategic military ally to the United States. It's a strategic partner to the United States in many ways. We don't belong in this land, right? White people don't belong in this land. We're not from here. I'm sorry. That's just the truth. We're not from here. I'm not from here, right? And I contribute by existing to the settler colonial project of the United States, but I try to be conscious of it and try to do my part. You know what I mean? That's another conversation we can have what that looks like. But Israel itself is a representation of white supremacy, and that's my answer.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think there is, it's interesting, there are white supremacists who are virulently anti-Semitic. They don't like Jewish people, but they love Israel. And you sort of say, well, how could that be? Because they see in Israel a reflection of their own aspirations for a supremacist state. They look at Israel and go, that's what we want here. Except we just want it, they want to be able to openly declare a white supremacist state in this country. And they see in the Zionist project a reflection of their own desires. In 2018, the nationality, is it the nationality bill? What's it called? The nation state law was passed in Israel, which explicitly says that Israel's not a state of all its citizens, it's a state of only one group, the Jewish citizens. It literally says that. And by the way, again, the fact that Israel's a quote, Jewish state is really incidental. It could be a state of anybody who is bent on settler colonialism. Or as a Palestinian friend of mine said, a neighbor of mine in South Orange said, look, we don't care who's oppressing us. It's the oppression that we don't want. Yeah. She said, you could be Jewish or Christian or Muslim. You could be from another planet, and it wouldn't matter. It doesn't matter where you're from in doing the oppression. What matters is, how are you oppressing people, right? So, but just to loop back to that, Trump, himself a white supremacist, he brags about his support for Israel. Right? And many other white supremacists, not Steve Bannon. Well, Steve Bannon is another one. Steve Bannon, another arch white supremacist. He was invited to the Zionist Organization of America, their annual gala in 2016 or 2017. And he was honored there. And he spoke at the Zionist Organization of America, even though he is or not even though, he is a white supremacist, and he was welcomed there. So there's always been that connection.
I'll say it's incumbent upon us to educate ourselves and learn about the struggle of Africans in Israel. It's the struggle of people of color in Israel. Look into that, because that plays into it, and it's bad.
I agree with all of my colleagues here. I want to add a point which I think Americans sometimes find really confusing, because race in this country is so much associated with certain bodily features, which is nonsense because, of course, it's a social construction, and they are different in the Middle East. So they go and they visit and they say, but everybody looks the same. Or some Israelis, more than half of Israeli Jewish population are people of color. They are not Jews that are originated in Europe, but in the Middle East and Africa. And many Palestinians are very fair-skinned and blue-eyed, and So when Americans look around, they're saying, where are the white people, where are the black people? I don't understand. And this is where it comes to play, and I think that's true in all countries of the world, not just in Israel, Palestine, that race is racialized differently in different places. Yeah. Palestinians are racialized in Palestine, racialized as people of color. While just being Jewish gives you a privilege, which is a racial privilege. Now, how do we tell people apart? We tell people apart, don't worry. There are many ways, before you even ask them to show the ID. For example, when you drive into the Israeli airport, the main airport, Ben Gurion Airport, the first line of defense, there's a lot of security in the airport, the first line of defense is there is a security officer with a machine gun that leans into your window, your car window, and says, hi, how are you doing? And you have to answer. They won't let you through if you don't answer. They listen to your accent. Mm-hmm. And that's like turn right, turn left, based on the accent. And if I try to mumble so they won't hear my very perfect white accent, they will not let me through. They will insist on hearing my accent. So people are racialized differently in different places, and that's confusing. But it doesn't mean that racism doesn't work the same way. And in fact, one of the most overtly racist parties in Israeli history is now the second largest party in the Israeli parliament after the recent elections. And they're going to be part of the coalition and be ministers and so on. And when I say overtly racist, I mean these are people who overtly call for getting rid of Israeli Palestinian citizens, who associate, who are against mixed marriages, cogeneration, how do you call it in English? There is a name for it. Mixed marriages between Jews and non-Jews, who are in favor of taking away people's rights officially and overtly, and they are the second largest party. while as the one party in Israeli politics that actually has on its platform that Israel should be a state of all of its citizens. That simple statement, Israel should be a state of all its citizens. Didn't get in. Didn't get in the last election, my party, by the way.
That's a very important note for us to mention and to name, so thank you for that, right? Races, people are racialized different ways in different spaces, but it works in the same way to oppress people. Yeah, so there was one more question from the audience, and read this, Iman, if I can have you kind of close us with this, no pressure, but I just love your answers on these specific questions. If you can close us with this, do you have anything further to say about why the university is framing DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, as the basis on which they are stifling Palestinian voices? And maybe ways to work against that.
Why they're using DEI to stifle the conversation?
Or maybe instead of why, how we can kind of approach that. Or if anyone else would like to answer too.
I would say that a way is ultimately to like turn the table against our movement. You know, I think fundamentally adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, right? Any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. So any advocacy for Palestine becomes hate speech. And it's against diversity, inclusion, I'm sorry, what does it stand for again? Equity and inclusion, thank you, DEI. Diversity, equity, and inclusion principles, right? So they use those concepts, radical, things that are supposed to be like radical concepts, things that are supposed to be welcoming and, you know, and opening, widening the net to stifle speech on Palestine or stifle speech on any other issue that they want to say, but it's hate speech. Why? Because they don't like the premise, I guess.
Yeah, I think that one thing that we do need to do a little bit better, and this is, I speak to other fellow Palestinians, but I think one thing that we consistently do is we remove our own oppression despite the fact that we're working towards our own liberation. But we're not centering the anti-Palestinian racism that consistently is seen and should be incorporated into those DEI efforts just as much as anti-Semitism is. I think we almost like pit them up against each other as though we can't claim that we are both anti-Palestinian, like against anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Semitism, which we know as part of the shared struggle is all part of the same thing. Yeah. When we speak up in Palestinian liberation, we're not calling folks to be anti-Semitic. We're saying that we are also against these anti-Semitic remarks. We're against this, and that we are calling for the liberation of all peoples, and we stand by that. And I think that we're consistently criticized. I love to call the enemy loves to call you out on the things that they know that they are good at, right? And I think that they're exactly trying to erase our own identities, our oppressions, our experiences, but we do need to do a better job at that. I think that actually there are a few universities, I think George Washington University right now is working to actually start encouraging the university itself to tend to anti-Palestinian racism as a part of those DEI efforts that the university claims it is committed to. And I think that is something that we could also do here, is that not make it just a story about anti-Semitism, and real anti-Semitism does need to be combated, right? Like we know that. Like I don't think that I feel like sometimes we have to say it, but I really also want to honor the fact that that is a part of shared struggle. Like that is already something that is incorporated into our movement. But I think that as much as we want to focus on those efforts, we also share we share the time and the effort into making sure that universities, that populations of students, that other folks are not also diluting our own experiences and our oppression. This isn't some sort of oppressive structure Olympics, right? Like this is not it. We're just calling to say that our experiences matter, and that we will not also fall into this path of claiming that anti-Semitism is the only way and the only way to go down, right? Like we always get lost in that, but we know what they're trying to do. We know how they weaponize anti-Semitism. And again, real anti-Semitism should be combated, but by no means what we're achieving and trying to work towards is working against that. We're working towards the liberation of all peoples.
Beautiful, thank you. I think not oppression Olympics and centering Palestinian voices is the perfect way to end. So I want to thank you all for engaging in this very generative conversation. I want you to help me thank our panelists for all of their amazing answers and thoughts, and the SJP and EJC organizers for putting it together. The conversation does not end here. This is not a conversation to just stop in 2 hours. We hope that you continue having these conversations, reach out to people to get all the resources you need, and have a great night. Yeah, thank you.